You might have heard of the term higher self, and I just wanted to share a little bit about that. All of us have a higher and a lower self. Most of us are used to working from the lower self, and there's nothing wrong with that. Our lower self has a lot to do with survival, with gaining power, with establishing the ego, and ego not in a bad way, just establishing the personality and the individuality of ourself here on earth, our character, our name, our history, our likes and dislikes, our preferences, our genders, all that kind of thing. And so our lower self is not good or bad, it's just what really shows up on earth for most people. When we're experiencing a spiritual awakening, we can feel sometimes off balance, and we can feel a fluctuation between our higher self and our lower self without warning, especially if you've been contemplating and reflecting, praying, meditating, taking time out in nature to still your thoughts and still your body. Those things can help us to access our higher self. And our higher self isn't too concerned about the survival of the body, being liked or disliked, competing with other people, um, leaving our mark. You know, the higher self is concerned with the big picture, how we connect to other people, how we connect to nature, how we connect to our past lives and our future lives, how our soul is developing over many eons through many different lives, many different incarnations on earth. If we're sick or we're injured, it's our higher self that isn't too concerned, that isn't too frazzled about the situation. Our higher self sees it as an opportunity for evolution, soul growth, and lessons. It's our lower self that gets a little bit stressed out, impatient, and in despair about difficult situations. But our higher self actually looks forward to difficulty and challenge and uncomfortable surprises, because our higher self knows that that's the only way for us to become more resilient and become more trusting, and to put aside control and let God or the universe take the wheel. You can recognize the higher self in you when you think of times that you've jumped into a situation suddenly and out of the blue to help somebody else that was struggling without thinking about yourself, without thinking about how you'd get paid back or be reimbursed. Um, those moments where you've just suddenly acted very selflessly and put other people before you, where you have had a deep peace and calm, even if there's a ton of chaos swirling around you. The part of you that has the knowing that in the great big scheme of things, this is actually moving forward your evolution and the evolution of everyone else who's involved. That's your higher self stepping in. So, if on your journey you've been feeling a fluctuation between the impatient, grabby, pushy um, parts that are your lower self, and then sometimes acting from a really benevolent, selfless place of oneness where you feel equal and part of the whole, that's a really good thing. On our spiritual journey, when we're experiencing that back and forth and those fluctuations, sometimes we can really enjoy those heightened feelings of being at peace and being at oneness and being connected, especially if we're doing some kind of spiritual practices, if we're away on a retreat, um, even spending the afternoon in nature. But then when we find ourselves back in our lower self, maybe dealing with a difficult situation or somebody who's really rubbing us the wrong way, or um, a total a total disaster, a big loss of some sort, often our survival self our lower self will kick in and want to be controlling things and calling the shots. And after we've experienced kind of the contrast of being in or a little more connected to the higher self, that lower self actually feels worse than ever. So, before, when we were only used to being in the lower self, that's all we knew. So, yeah, maybe it was annoying or we didn't like those parts of ourselves, but for the most part, that's just how people on earth act, and that's their way of being. So now that we have a contrast on our spiritual journey, we have these highs and these lows. And we start to see the lower self. Sometimes we can kind of criminalize the lower self. We can demonize it. We can get frustrated with that part of us and feel shameful. But it's not for that. There's a huge role that the lower self has, basically to keep us alive and to give us the skills to navigate this planet in all its challenges and density. We need to have that lower self. The perspective of our higher self, knowing those higher levels of being, even if they're short and temporary, they actually help us to balance out the lower self so that we're not freaking out on people, we're not cheating people, we're not being super manipulative. Because that higher self has a bit more of the light of God and is shining on all the intricacies and the deviousness that the lower self can have. So in a way, it's purifying. The higher self and the light of the higher self is purifying the lower self. And back to the higher self, I had a really powerful dream that helped remind me a bit more about the higher self and that we all have this. And in the dream, I was walking through some city streets. I was going in and out of some buildings, and I was really transparent. So I was looking out of my eyes from like a wispy kind of ghost-like body. And I was fully me, I was fully aware, and I was fully calm. And as I walked through the streets, I could see, people begging on the side of the road. I walked into a church and there were people feverishly and desperately praying and singing and trying to connect to God. And I went through the city and I saw different scenes. And every time I passed a different scene, I would smile at the people that I was encountering because I was in a place of perfect peace and balance as the higher self. But the people couldn't hear me. They couldn't hear me. I was doing things like, I was just shaking people's hands and, offering, something with the beggars, what can I do to help you? I've got something for you. And they couldn't see or they couldn't hear me. I went into the churches and, I would kind of approach somebody who was sitting and like desperately praying and feeling so disconnected from the divine. And I was trying to tell them, God is here. God is inside you. God is everywhere. You're not far. You're not as far as you think. And they couldn't hear me. And so I woke up from that dream and I realized, and I was fully back in my body. I was, kind of in my lower self again, where most of us stay. And I realized that we all have this higher self. None of us is exempt. But it can be really hard to connect and see things from the higher self's perspective. So, just a few thoughts on connecting with your higher self. Being in a loud, busy place around a lot of people and with a lot of deadlines is a challenging way to hear the voice of your higher self. It's not impossible, but it's more challenging. If and when you have time to step away, even for a couple of hours from the busyness of your life and your phone and your commitments, you don't even need to go into a super formal meditation. You just need to find a quiet place of reflection, sitting, lying down. Again, nature is a great tuning fork that can kind of bring you in. And close your eyes and just imagine that transparent, glowing, wispy version of yourself that exists outside of this dimension but is still very close to you, very connected to you. It's like you in the future, after you've left behind the troubles of this earth and you've understood what you need to understand. Imagine that higher self version of you just above and behind you, observing your life, you going about your day, you having your ups and downs. And ask your higher self what message it might have for you. What you're not seeing, what you might be missing, what you might need to change. And in those quiet moments, something should come to you, whether it's big or small. Because our higher selves are always with us, always around us, just kind of like here, waiting for us to tune in, waiting for us to ask, waiting for us to pay attention. And I really could see this in my dream, where very few people, if anyone, was able to connect and hear from their higher selves. And I know my dream was specifically for me, but it applies to all of us. Yeah, I think that's all.